Hello, Brian. Can you hear me?
Hello, Adam. So we had a bit of a failed mic check. God, I want the green room. The Twitter green room would be so useful.
Was Cliff unable to participate?
Cliff was unable to participate. So we'll see. Cliff is now exploring alternative methods. I would love to know I wish I knew how Twitter Spaces worked. I just like, why does it not work on the desktop? And why? I mean, it doesn't work on kind of arbitrary devices with a mic. It's
What was he trying it on?
unclear.
Like his keyboard firmware that he wrote himself.
But like,
you're not wrong.
That's not impossible.
Like, why is this not working? I wrote this firmware myself.
Right, exactly. This firmware, it looks exactly like an Android device, so I don't understand. Right. Yeah, unclear. Laura, I don't know if you had a sense of what he was actually.
He described it as a burner phone. For background, Cliff doesn't install a lot of apps on his phones, and so he does not have the Twitter app installed on his phone. So he couldn't really participate in this. So he's been trying to set a thing up, and so maybe it will work out. But that's kind of the situation we're working.
I hope so. I feel that, like, if it doesn't work out, we should just sit here and just talk about Cliff for. Oh my goodness gracious! Here he is. Oh wow. Okay, that's so exciting. Cliff, are you there? Laura, are you there? Laura,
I am.
Laura's here, and I think Cliff might be there. Cliff, you there?
Cliff, you're currently muted, but if you hit the button, it should unmute you now.
Now you're unmuted, but we hear nothing.
We hear nothing. It's so tantalizing. Cliff is like, I found a bug in my firmware, and I pushed a fix. So I'm still calling in from my keyboard with a microphone on it. But no, it mostly works. Okay, you've already. So Cliff, you show up right now as muted. But you did show up. Yeah.
Backup record. I mean, old school recording, which I still think is the better recording, is.
It is the better recording.
Just so you know. It
is the better recording. No, I think actually both are going to be. The old school recording is definitely necessary because they haven't generated a way for you to download an MP3 out of it that I have seen.
Yeah.
I think all they have done is allowed you to effectively play the recording that they always make.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I don't know. It makes sense. Like,
it makes sense.
They don't want to put you on someone else's platform. They want to keep you on their platform. That's fine.
I understand that. But then the problem is that after 3 days, it gets deleted.
Oh, that's a huge problem.
Yeah, right. Sorry. Yeah, I was like, Adam's being awfully cheerful about what I think is a kind of a limited facility.
Yeah, that's jank.
Okay, Cliff is now reconnecting. And Cliff is gone. So...
I could hold my phone up like phone to phone.
Oh, we have definitely. Sorry if you weren't in some of the brainstorming conversations about this.
I was talking about OBS setups. Like, we were starting to get a little in detail.
Nice.
Yeah, we had a lot of ideas. So I'm hoping that Cliff can bounce back in. I still prefer the idea of Cliff speaking through Steve as his representative on Earth, and Steve, but Steve only speaking in his own voice. So Steve's like, I will convey that question to Cliff. Okay. Cliff has said.
This is like two middle schoolers who refuse to speak. Okay, Cliff. Brian wants you to know.
All those years paying attention in CCD are about to pay off big time. Finally.
That's right. I was thinking.
Steve, is Cliff in the room with you right now as we're talking?
Right.
So, for background, for those of you who have joined us and know this yet, one of our last folks who is like kind of the architect of a lot of this is having some technical difficulties. So we're trying to get him going and sort of talking about that.
Okay,
now,
technical difficulties is the glass
Cliff
half
is here.
empty.
Cliff, feel free to shout and interrupt at any point.
Can Cliff speak? All eyes turn to the gray egg that has muted itself. Gray egg, unmute your. There, connecting. So yeah, so you all right, you were going like middle schooler. Your mind went to like middle schooler playing like social in between. I was viewing more like Old Testament. Steve goes to the mount, and
Oh, hey, we got you, Cliff.
Yeah, Twitter on Android seems to not like you to have a headset plugged in.
Why would it?
oh.
Seems like pilot error.
Oh God! Well, I was just gonna say, like you were saying, when you said that the Cliff was having some technical difficulties, is the glass half empty version? The glass half full version that I prefer is that Cliff is rightfully a Twitter conscientious objector, and so Cliff, thank you very much for being willing to join us. We obviously are very excited to have you here. I'm also going to be entertained how many followers Person with Mouth, also known as OK Spaces Lol, ends up with out of this, because a terrific account. Oh, hopefully he's back. Cliff, are you back?
If you plug in headphones after joining, your mic will never work again.
Oh, Twitter Spaces. I am sorry. I don't even know what to say.
Hey, it's all good. I mean, so what are we talking about?
So we're talking about. All right. That's right. Well, right now we're talking about technical difficulties with Twitter Spaces. So we are talking about Hubris and Humility, a system that we're super excited about. We open sourced coming up on 2 weeks ago, and we've talked about, I think some of the folks have not read it. We've talked about both some of the history of it. Cliff has Adam, did you watch Cliff's presentation on this, by the way? Have you seen it?
Yeah, I did.
It is outstanding.
Really,
it is really, really good.
Yeah, really great.
And I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I thought it was really, really good. I just like because it is very hard to get pacing right, where you've got something that has got dense technical content, but isn't just like overwhelming people with a fire hose. It's a failure mode that I may have fallen into.
Cliff, if I may, it was annoyingly good. It was like, why have I never achieved anything close to this? But it was delightful.
It was very good.
Thanks.
And it was also a lot of work. So it was good to see so many people react so positively to it. Cliff then also posted a transcript of it along with a pointer to a FAQ, which also folks should read. The fervently anticipated questions, which were great. But Cliff, I wondered if you might, because one thing we have not talked about is the prehistory of Hubris, namely your experience prior to Oxide that kind of informed it. So I wondered I'm not sure where you think the prehistory of Hubris starts, but I would love to know, because I've got my own kind of guesses, but I'm not even sure I know the answer to this, about the systems that you had used that informed some dissatisfaction or where you saw some room for improvement.
Gosh. Well, in the beginning, when they were only adding machines. No, I think most of the formative influences on this came from writing the firmware for Project Loon at Google. We were in a high reliability context that wasn't a human safety context. It wasn't a medical devices context, but it was a case where once you let go of the device and it flies up into the stratosphere, no one can reach the reset button, and you're kind of hosed if anything goes wrong. So,
Cliff, could you give a little context on Loon? I actually, I didn't know about Loon really before working with you, and it's it's an amazing project, honestly. So I think people would love some sort of a refresher on that.
Yeah, I mean, the short version is it's a project I started with a couple of people in 2011, trying to extend the reach of internet access to more underserved areas using high altitude balloons. And I originally joined the project because I thought it wouldn't work and I wanted to prove that, and I failed. So the project was escaping the wild.
I have a follow-up question that I'm afraid to ask. So just go on Loon.
But I wound up specializing as the project got bigger on electronics and firmware, and then eventually running the firmware team. So that was that's the context for the need for high reliability stratosphere firmware. It's kind of like going to space, except that honestly, space is a lot better understood.
So what were some of the similarities? I mean, I guess there are clear similarities of going to space, but what were some of the differences about the kind of high altitude flight versus space?
Well, so I've never done space professionally, but I'm friends with a bunch of people who have, and the main thing that we were able to take advantage of, because we weren't doing space, is that our launches were cheap. So if you just have to fill the thing with helium and release it from some unpopulated area far from an airport, you can iterate faster than if you have to pay tens of millions of dollars per launch. So in that sense, we were able to, we had it easy in many ways. We could iterate faster. We could launch new versions of the firmware more often than you could have in a space situation where you pretty much get one launch. I mean, until this Starlink stuff started happening, obviously. But so that was nice. The downside is that we were building systems that were going to be constantly buffeted by wind. We couldn't control which direction they were going. They don't stay in a constant orbit. They're moved around by chaotic atmospheric forces. And so we had to build large weather simulators to be able to steer our things around. And that eventually worked. But, you know, that wasn't my department. I was more concerned with the power and thermal and communications happening in the actual device.
Okay, and what were some of the problems that you had in the system software on that? Some of the challenges that you had running for the firmware for that thing?
I mean, there's the problems that we solved, and then there's the problems that we never really solved that led to Hubris. The problems that we solved were, we had a relatively small team, many of whom were not trained in the area, because I was sort of deliberately recruiting people with non-aerospace backgrounds, because I started at the top of the software stack doing UI, and I've been gradually working down. And I find that there's a lot of software engineering process and principles that I picked up on the way down that people that were trained mostly from the bottom up may not have picked up. So in many ways, it was easier to pick up people with UI experience who already know things like unit testing and design patterns and teach them firmware than the other way around on our accelerated schedule. So we were working with a bunch of people who didn't have a lot of firmware experience, and we were working in C and subsequently C++. So this meant that we needed to build frameworks where a person relatively new to the concept of writing drivers could knock out drivers quickly with a minimum of shooting themselves in the foot. And so we built a framework called Major Tom on Loon that was in C++ and was not memory protected, that ran on similar processors to what we're using at Oxide. And that worked fairly well, and Loon was still using it up until they shut down earlier this year. But we had a bunch of frustrations with it because we had memory corruption bugs in flight that turned out to be stray pointer writes from some of the C code. We had stack overflows and clashes. We had buffer overflows, the sort of things you normally get when you're writing a large C application. Except it's really frustrating when you can't get to the thing to either talk to it on the console or look at the memory through JTAG or pull a crash dump because the thing's on the other end of an incredibly narrow satellite link. So we had to sort of work with the constraints of our tooling. And the whole time I was wanting a different system. And what that different system looked like evolved over time, but Hubris is sort of the latest run at the ideal, trying to build something that enables fast iteration on a more robust platform for contexts where you can't get to the system to reboot it.
You know, Cliff, that was one of the questions I had for you, because when you joined Oxide, we were down a pretty different path.
Yeah.
And I was curious the degree to which you came in sort of knowing the system that you ideally wanted to build. And to be clear, I don't feel like you, I think you gave that other path a pretty earnest shot. But did you have that strong sense walking in the door about what you wanted to build and what we needed to build, and that they were pretty lined up?
Adam, I assume he came to Oxide for the same reason he came to Loon, that he was certain it was going to fail, and he just wanted to watch how it unfolded.
And then prove it.
Well,
Exactly.
and I was on the frenemy project to Loon at Google, one of many.
That's right.
And Major Tom was actually successful, whereas everything that we built in GlobalBit completely failed. So when we talk about the difficulties of space and things, like the traditional approach, which was more or less what GlobalBit was trying to do, really didn't even get to the point of a single launch, where Major Tom definitely made it much further. And so while Major Tom had flaws, it definitely demonstrated there were alternate approaches that you could go. And Hubris definitely feels like the next version of that in definitely improving some of the known failure modes and things that you do encounter. Still doesn't address things like, if you're in space, rad event, single upset events and stuff like that happens. It's hard. There's other things you need to do to deal with that.
That's right.
But this is a step in the direction of, there's a lot of things that you can just do to make your day-to-day debugging experience and overall like reliability due to code quality be much better.
And a belt and suspenders approach can help a lot there, and that's what we did with Hubris. But to answer Adam's question, parts of Hubris closely resemble other prototype systems that I designed in the years since I left Loon. Some of them are on GitHub, but I didn't really have a clear idea. And honestly, when I arrived, we were trying to use Talk, and Talk actually meets a lot of my criteria. It lets you write memory isolated tasks that can fail separately. Talk even goes so far as to let you do in-system upgrades of individual tasks, which I consider to be kind of an anti-feature for our application, but it's really useful in other applications. Yeah. And we gave that a run, and I mean, honestly, you build the system with the team that you have. So Hubris's design, and I wrote it up in an RFD that we haven't published externally yet, but this was the proposal that, oh shit, maybe we should write an operating system. The system design was based a lot on all y'all, actually, trying to keep things to technologies that people had previous experience with and build a system that the team could work on. And the fact that we had people with previous QNX experience and other, Linux kernel experience and things like that was really enabling in that sense.
You are walking the fine line between damnation and praise, and I can't tell which one it is. I actually don't know. That's interesting that I also feel like, and Laura, maybe you were talking about, because you'd done some of the early work as Cliff was coming to Oxide in terms of scoping out the different operating systems. And I just remember you having a line in your RFD of being like, well, writing our own operating system is clearly like everyone's dream, but is impractical for a bunch of good reasons that you outlined.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm pretty sure that it's going to haunt me for, as long as I continue to work at Oxide about we're never going to write our own operating system. But I mean, I think more than anything, and reflecting on that and how we ended up getting to Hubris, is that I think writing out was supposed to be all available operating systems like things for what we could potentially use for the service processor and root of trust. And I think that was certainly a good exercise. And I think at the time we were still leaning towards Talk, and I think Talk had a lot of things appealing. But I think ultimately what it was is when we eventually decided to shift away from Talk, I think we concluded that having already done this work, that there really wasn't anything out there. So, I think I put that writing our own was the last resort, but I mean, it really was just because there wasn't anything out there, which is where we ended up, jumping to Hubris.
Totally. And you should not be haunted by that. I thought like that. First of all, I certainly agreed with that when you wrote it. It makes total sense. I actually think to the contrary, the fact, just as you said, it's like you made a good case for why if there's something extant off the shelf, of course we should use it. And we went, some would say, I feel I personally went we went really far. We really tried to get it to work, and it just was increasingly clear. And I was trying to remember the ordering at which it was clear to whom when that we really should give our own thing a shot. Cliff, I feel like you had the first realization. I feel like I was a late adopter. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I wasn't actually sure how well it was going to go over, right? Because this is the sort of thing that can go over like a lead balloon. And so I put together RFD 41, which is the original design proposal, and floated that. And I think I feel like that was sort of the tipping point. But I think that the process that we went through was absolutely the right process, because had there been something off the shelf, it would have saved us time. And over the years, like, because I do embedded and I like good software and I like having the computer check my mistakes so that I can think about harder problems, I've tried basically everything I can get my hands on. There are a few I can't get my hands on. Green Hill's Integrity is pretty high on that list, but I hear good things. But among the things that are available open source or trial, there's just kind of isn't anything covering this corner of the space. Talk comes the closest. And I think that the evaluation that Laura and Patrick and you were well underway on when I showed up was critical.
Yeah, and then I think that, sorry, Steve, go ahead.
There also is like, as somebody who showed up after this was already done, like Hubris existed by the time I showed up on the scene. But there was one comment on the internet that I think like exemplified some of this and like showed this due diligence, though, is because somebody said like, it's impressive how this is like the pragmatic choice for you all. And the only thing I could really say was, well, it's a little hard to sell writing your own OS as the pragmatic choice, but like you all did your homework, and it turns out that just actually is the case. Like that was in fact the right call. So,
I mean, there were two things on the other side of the ledger that I recall. One was like taking on a massive like compiler project, and the other was trying to turn a open source project that didn't necessarily want to be turned the way we wanted to turn it. So yes. It was the pragmatic choice.
And one of the things that I appreciate about Oxide is that we had from the beginning language for expressing that. So the fundamental problem with trying to lead talk in a direction that isn't consistent with their goals is that we understood that value alignment and alignment in motivations and goals is critical. And that's a thing that we like actively reflect on and talk about. So when it became clear that we were going to be pushing talk in a way that is effectively against their values, because talk prizes a number of things, including understandability of the system and teachability of the system to undergraduates, neither of which are goals for our firmware, but they're still laudable goals. And pushing talk away from those goals would have done them a disservice.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I would love to say that I learned that lesson the easy way, but I didn't. We learned that all comes out of my reflection of the joint divorce with Node.js, which honestly, I got to give credit to currently one of Oxide's investors, but was it also an investor in Joyent, Charles Bueller, who really insisted that I speak at NodeConf after this divorce, effectively. And I'm like, Charles, I'm not going to speak at NodeConf because I have nothing to say about Node that's going to be productive. And he's like, oh, like now I definitely want you to speak. And I'm like, oh my God, that's so broken.
Get your finest tomato repellent outfit and get ready to be jeered at.
Yeah. Totally. But I have to say, I really thank him for that, because it really pushed me, because I had not really processed it very well. I think I was still in that mode of just like, of not really thinking about what had happened. And it was actually helpful for me to go back, like, wait, what did actually happen here? And actually there was this values divergence, which I think is important, because it just clicked for exactly the point you're making. It's not that the values that Node aspired to were wrong, or the values that Joyent aspired to were wrong. In fact, it made it worse that they were both laudable values, because we were both trying to make a relationship work when we actually weren't totally committed to the other's values. Certainly not. And in that talk, I talk about how really JavaScript wants this kind of ubiquitousness of programming, wants everyone to be able to program in JavaScript, which is an extremely laudable goal. And Joyent really wanted Node to be completely debuggable, also a very laudable goal. And there were points where those just came into conflict with one another, and you kind of had to pick one. And we kind of made different choices, and then those choices became flashpoints. And We definitely, and Steve, I know for you in terms of processing, for me, like coming to Rust, I loved the fact that Rust was so upfront about its values. And Steve, you've got a great talk too that people should see talking about that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's also, on that note, something that Rick said earlier that I wanted to like mention too, with the choice of using Rust for this was like and also sort of what Cliff was saying about it's easier to teach high level people firmware sometimes. I used to joke, like back in the day, early on in Rust, my job as like a Ruby person who's now in a low level language is just to like convince the other low level people that they are allowed to have nice things. Like it just like when Yehuda and Carl first like wrote Cargo, like it almost didn't happen. Like Cargo actually was like a thing that the people at the time were actually very against investing time into. And the only reason the Cargo exists is because Dave Herman was in charge at Mozilla, relatively speaking. He was like, director at the time. And he said, I think this needs to exist and I'm going to put budget into it and I'm going to make it happen. And I don't care what you guys say. And a lot of the like people at the time said like, cool, you guys can use that toy or whatever, but we'll keep writing make files. And then when they saw it, they were like, oh my God, I'm never writing a make file ever again. And Cargo is definitely not perfect. And we've wrangled a bunch with Cargo to make Hubris work. If you've checked any of that stuff, there's kind of a giant pile of things there. But like the point is that it can be really, really hard sometimes to convince people that they're allowed to have nice things and those can work. And that's like reasonable for you. And so that's also a thing I see in Hubris and Humility is not just like from the angle of using a language that wants to make these things nicer, but just also like, I don't know, I barely even know how to use GDB. Like it's terrible and the interface is bad and it's confusing and I messed up all the time. But like Humility has like a lot of really cool stuff in it. It's totally achievable with GDB if you're willing to like fight the lion or whatever. I don't know if that's not even a metaphor. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to agree that that's not a metaphor because there is an actual lion living in the
Yes. At a meeting earlier today, I mixed like 5 metaphors into 2 sentences, so I've just been on a weird kick today. Anyway.
And Brian, I mean, you cut the first code in Humility. Do you want to talk about that since we've alluded to it a bit?
Yeah, so I mean, and that kind of honestly came out of our need to debug talk. And so because the other thing that was making things even more complicated, I would say, in terms of part of the reason we came to talk is because we were looking at OpenTitan, which was based on RISC-V, an FPGA or an ASIC, still unclear, and we never ponied up the $500,000 to be able to get this question answered. But the OpenTitan was using Talk as its system software. So that's kind of how we kind of came into it. And then you and Laura were engaged in some of the things we needed to go do to RISC-V to get Ropey and Rippy to work. And what we needed that, I'm trying to remember, like...
It was to make it relocatable so that we could compile things without knowing a priori where they were going to land in memory.
And why did we want that? What was driving us towards that? I mean, clearly, like for a bunch of good reasons.
Why would you not want that?
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
Like, yeah. So the read-only position independence means that you can compile these binaries and then toss them together into a memory image without having to aggressively relocate or rewrite them, which is great if you're an image builder like Talk. And this sort of thing can mostly work on ARM, and support at the time was a little behind on LLVM. But the read-write position independent stuff is so that you can use a single ROM image in Flash to support multiple tasks with different RAM areas, which would be a huge space saver and be great, right? So we absolutely wanted those, and we still don't have those.
And then we were also at the same time looking at different FPGAs, really thinking that the root of trust would be a secure FPGA. The problem is that the secure FPGA, it's not quite a contradiction in terms, but it's close. There are not a lot of vendors, and as it turns out, they kind of rely on security through obscurity.
Yeah, if you want to buy security-oriented chips, do not decap them and inspect them, and do not disassemble their ROMs, because you will be very disappointed. And now we're where we are today.
And, right, because it turns out these things have these kind of Cortex, these ARM hardcores, and that then led us down the road of like, well, actually, what do we need the reconfigurable computing for? Maybe we should just go through and use hard cores. And then I think Cliff, I correct me if I'm because I'm probably misremembering all of this, but at some point you were like, the STM32 F4 on the F407 Discovery board is a part that I, Cliff, know really, really well. This is a well understood part. Everything's been reverse engineered on it. We should use this as a platform to go explore a new system. Is kind of how I remember that happening.
Yeah, I was approaching it from a slightly different perspective of it seems like this soft logic RTL component of the project is going to be a significant risk to our ability to ship a product, because good RTL people, and particularly good RTL people who are willing to interface with high-level languages, are worth their weight in gold and can be difficult to find and hire. And we've got a few now, but at the time we had 1.5, and that was going to be a problem. So yeah, I suggested maybe hard logic would be a less risky path, and that's where we are right now.
Hey, Cliff, this was probably a flip comment, but I think at the time you also observed, like, why do we even need to run multiple tasks on this thing? Just give me 7 ARM cores and I'll just run 7 different tasks.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to be said for that. If you control the silicon, you can do silly things like that. We don't control the silicon, however, so.
As we learned the hard way, see Laura and Rick's vulnerability in the OPC 55.
Yeah, and also I think to the FPGA thing, I think we also ran into issues just because we're dedicated to trying to doing everything open, and the state of the open source tool chain for FPGAs is just not there yet. And I think we're all eagerly awaiting the day when that actually comes.
Absolutely, Laura. Very good point. And the vendor that is the furthest ahead on the secure FPGA seems to be the furthest behind on open source tooling. In that we couldn't even get. I mean, Aryan was trying. I saw Aryan in here earlier. Maybe he can hop in and offer his perspective. But Aryan was just trying to get it to work on Linux. And they're like, we don't really support. Yeah, it should work, but you're kind of on your own. Just to get their proprietary tools to work on Linux, you're like, oh, come on. Let alone the true open source ecosystem allowing us to actually put our own bitstream down. And so Cliff, you started. How long did that process take from kind of initial, like, I'm going to take a swing at this, to having something working? Because I remember that as being remarkably short, but maybe I'm misremembering.
Well, the thing people forget when they talk about writing an operating system is that you have a tremendous amount of flexibility in defining what an operating system is. So if you're writing a deliberately minimal kernel, you can get something up in a couple of weeks, which I think is what we did. And from there, it's just the death of 1,000 paper cuts of all the other things that you need to do, like the debug tooling and the build system. And
I mean, we're coming up on that the whole 2,200 lines of code thing, right? That we were joking about. Nobody got mad about, but we thought they might. The core kernel itself is like 2,200 lines of code. So getting that written is like not impossible. Obviously, you need more than just the kernel in a system like this, but it's smaller than you would think.
It's also like, it would be closer to 1,500 lines of code if Rust format didn't really like using vertical.
I just love the fact that we can't talk about Hubris without possibly linking to a Rust format issue. But hey, we wouldn't do this if they would close their issues. So. Cliff, you went into there for a couple of weeks. Someone actually asked me on Hacker News, like, hey, what was the process for this? Like, did you have some big document where you described all this in advance? And my memory of this was we were hitting not just one or two, but quite a few of these roadblocks where it's like, this doesn't feel like this is going to be. Laura, I remember in particular when you, Adam, and I were talking about you going seriously into LLVM to like get all the ropey rippy stuff working. We're just like, wow, this is going to be rough sledding. Like, it's all software, but this is complicated software for sure. But so we were, and my recollection of this was Cliff is going to go down a couple of weeks and let's feel if we're on the right path or not. And Laura, I love your recollection of this, but my recollection of that after Cliff's like only a couple of weeks, it felt like this is definitely the right path. It just felt like really, really clear that the budding Hubris was the right path.
I'm honestly trying to remember this at the same time, but that sounds about right. That like I think we continued trying to do stuff with talk in parallel and trying to figure out what was actually going to make sense. And I mean, I think I did end up pulling down LLVM and also start to do a little bit of looking at it, and then also try and figure out exactly what would be a path forward. But I mean, I mostly just remember Hubris coming up, and then just being really excited to play with it and actually see what happened with it.
And then somewhere along the line about this time, we did a journal club, I think. Am I remembering this correctly? Because we did a journal club where, Cliff, you picked I think it was the Jonathan Shapiro paper, right? I'm trying to remember the actual papers that we had for that.
Yeah, we did Vulnerabilities in Synchronous IPC Systems by Jonathan Shapiro, which is a good sort of primer on how not to do synchronous wrong. And then we did the Elphinstone paper on like 20 years of L4 learnings and recollections that goes through the L4 family tree and things that they've learned, which is another great source of information to mine if you're designing a system based on message passing. And I think both of those papers are actually linked from the Hubris reference documentation in the bibliography in the last section, if anybody's curious. But they're a great sort of jump starter on how it's like a concentrated shot of 30 years of learning in the microkernel space.
And for some small context, Journal Club is basically like Oxide internal, everyone reads a paper and then we get together to talk about it situation.
Yeah, and we deliberately have a shrink to fit process on that. I think that a bunch of us had different experiences that we pulled together of journal clubs that kind of hadn't worked exactly right, and or had been like too much or too little, and what we opted to do at Oxide, which certainly in this case worked great, I think generally works pretty well, is pretty shrink to fit in that if someone comes up with a paper that they think is interesting, they create effectively as like, hey, I'd like to discuss this paper, and as soon as I think we say 3 people have read it, then you schedule a conversation. And the idea is that everyone reads the paper before having the conversation, so it doesn't end up being a recap. And that journal club, I remember being super excited. I mean, it was great for me because obviously, fine, the QNX background, but I've always believed that microkernels had been kind of disregarded prematurely, and especially the L3, L4 stuff is really, really interesting. Lidke, I think, did you ever meet Lidke, Cliff?
I did not. I did, however, work for Brad Chen, the man who killed Mock.
Yes. Yeah, Brad Chen. So elaborate on the man who killed Mock, actually, because that's...
so microkernels were fashionable in the early 90s, late 80s, and Mock was a microkernel out of Carnegie Mellon that is actually still around in your Mac and iOS devices as part of the kernel. And it was sort of the hotness at the time, but it had some performance problems. And so a couple of papers came out that analyzed the performance problems and made the argument that these performance problems are inherent in microkernel design, that if you were following these principles, you would never have a system that could outperform a certain asymptotic level, and that monolithic kernels would always be faster. And this caused 2 things to happen. One, it caused the Mock, let's put Mock in everything microkernel bubble to sort of burst roughly overnight in academic terms. At the same time, though, it really pissed off a guy at IBM, who was Jochen Liedtke, who wrote L4, because he had written L3 previously, and L3 is also a microkernel, but looks nothing like Mock. And so L4 came out along with a angry-sounding paper from Liedtke describing, basically, the thesis is microkernels can be really fast if you don't do them wrong. And Hubris is heavily L4 inspired. I think it's a great system to look at.
I did not know that Liedtke had effectively the same reaction. So it is so funny that L4 had the same kind. So Littke, by the way, for those who are unaware, Littke has passed away, died at a really young age. And I had read his L3 paper as an undergraduate, and he has an IPC a paper on IPC performance in L3, and some of the tricks that he used in L3 that were I thought incredibly clever to make IPC fast, and showing that you could make IPC fast if you just dedicated yourself to the craft of the actual implementation, that the implementation really mattered. And that paper, have you read that paper, Adam?
No, never.
Oh man, that really spoke to me at kind of like a critical time, because I think part of the frustration that I was feeling as an undergraduate in computer science at that time is that the implementation was being dismissed as an implementation detail, that it was the architecture that was important, and that the implementation was for little people, to use a Leona Helmsleyism. And as someone who really valued the implementation, I kind of felt that like academic computer science was, taking a dump on me to a certain degree. And here was this paper that was actually enshrining the importance of the implementation, which really spoke to me. But I did not realize that L4 was then, I mean, of course, it all makes sense, because in addition to this paper that really was disparaging of microkernels, they were also disparaging of memory protection and pointed to the commercial success of Windows as evidence that people don't want memory protection in a system. And
QED.
Reading that paper was the moment I decided not to go to graduate school. I actually was so just out of my mind in reading that I'm like, I'm going into industry, because I just was, and it's probably unfair, probably an overcorrection, but so I'm just, Cliff, that is really fascinating to know that Littke had that direct inspiration on L4. And I think that the Littke's work is outstanding, and Shapiro also references Littke's work a lot, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I mean, he's eminently referenceable. The papers are fairly accessible, even without an academic background. And Hubris's IPC mechanism is not fast, to be clear. It is not currently fast, but it's designed as sort of a shadow of L4's mechanism, such that I'm confident that if we have the time, we can make it fast. It uses a somewhat awkward register ABI that I know we can make fast in context switch passing on ARM, and we just haven't actually taken the time to write the fast paths yet. But my hope is that we won't have any, that will be straightforward if tedious.
We are not yet a true microkernel, but we will be a true microkernel when we feel like becoming a true microkernel.
And the reason why the FAQ that I wrote for Hubris goes out of its way to not use the M word is somehow in my career, I've worked on a series of teams where microkernel has been kind of a contentious or bad term. And I came to Oxide from the Fuchsia project at Google, which, depending on who you ask, either is or is not a microkernel. And I think that sentiment breaks down very cleanly along organizational boundaries within the team. But it's easier to build software if we don't get hung up on these kinds of terminological distinctions. And
I should just point out that the terminology microkernel falling along organizational lines is hilarious due to, the structure of both microkernels and
there is something there's something karmic about it, isn't there? That your organization is structured as a microkernel, so every organization can have its own feuds within it. I mean, there is something. Yeah, it's interesting.
See, I don't want to pull the who is the coolest kid kind of thing, but I was obsessed with exokernels in college, which I know is a thing that you all don't really like. But that was the equivalent of no one believes that my preferred style of operating system is real, but I'm going to make it real and show them. They haven't. That's a whole different can of beans.
So the exokernel is actually interesting. And first of all, actually, Cliff, I want to go back to the wisdom that you had, because I think it's important. Where labels in software can be helpful, but they can also serve to be really corrosive, where, oh, I am actually just going to move this label onto this thing that is a system, that is something I don't like, as an excuse to not like this new thing. Like, and I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but I think that's part of the reason that you deliberately wanted to avoid characterizing hubris as a this or a that or something else.
I think use case matters like so much. One of the things that I've reflected on from Fuchsia, we like our APC mechanism could be a lot faster as well, but it's working just great where we're deploying it. I think one of the fastest ways to kill a microkernel is to try and self-host a C compiler system for it on top of a microkernel, because C compiler file system I/O operations are extremely short-lived, so they're like a pathological case, whereas that's not most of the workloads that we're building that we care about.
And I would also go to the point of saying that no truly useful system ends up being purely within any category. Right? I mean, Linux, you could call a monolith, and then you've got Fuse floating over there, and you've got a handful of other things. And, you know, if you're not transcending categories, it's probably not working out too well.
That's right, and I'd actually like to amplify that point. We computer people, if I can speak in gross generalizations, like to stuff things into categories. We like to have labels, and we like our labels to be mutually exclusive from each other. And in general, this is a complete fabrication that is for our own intellectual and communication convenience. These labels are not real. We are making them real by putting emphasis on them. And if it's not evident that I was a liberal arts major, that'll become more obvious. But the fight over whether something is or is not a microkernel is like a complete waste of energy, because there's likely nuanced reasons why, well, in some respects, this resembles a microkernel, and in these other respects, it doesn't resemble a traditional microkernel, and in these other areas, it seems to have lifted ideas from monolithic systems. And I've tried to be careful writing the Hubris FAQ to be clear that these categories aren't necessarily meaningful, but it's useful to draw sort of more nuanced comparisons to other things.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that there are so many attributes of hubris that are just like, that are orthogonal to those distinctions, that are, I think, really important. And that there are a bunch of different things that hubris has done that at least I haven't experienced in another system. One of them that I think, because to me, one of the early indicators that the talk path was going to be really, really brutal was not just, even we were talking about going, you know, rappelling down into LLVM and Ropey and Rippy and all these other things. It all kind of felt like somewhat attainable. What was going to be really, really difficult was dealing with the talk is built, Cliff, and you said this earlier, around dynamic programming loading, where I want to load a program that I've never seen before because it's a student's program, and that student is going to be iterating many times over, reloading a new program, and that makes sense for a teaching system. And it does not make sense for a system that we're trying to attest, where we actually want everything. And I just remember thinking, like, boy, that is going to be just brutal. And Cliff, I remember at one point you being like, you know, like in our system, like we don't want any of that, and we're gonna have to do some totally new mechanism to deal with this. And it's like, oh boy, this is gonna be. And one of the things you did with Hubris that was certainly one of the early things that I personally I was like, wow, that is very clearly the right path for us, is this knowing all tasks at compile time, not actually having dynamically loaded tasks, and not having a loader at all. And it just eliminates a big class of problems. What was your kind of inspiration there? Because that to me was new and exciting about Hubris.
Well, I mean, the deeply embedded systems that I've worked on have always been structured that way. But their operating systems usually didn't support it. They contained like FreeRTOS is probably the simplest, easily available RTOS. I guess Zephyr is getting more popular, but FreeRTOS has been around longer. FreeRTOS has dynamic task creation and destruction routines, and this is how you make your tasks. And if I'm the one writing the application, these routines are called in a loop at the very start and then never called again, but they are still living there, and the data structures have been designed in support of that use case. And fundamentally, as embedded programmers, we get to cheat. We are not building a laptop. We are not Chrome OS. We are not the Google Home Hub. We know everything that the system is going to do in advance. So let's shrink wrap effectively the kernel to the application and shrink wrap it around the tasks that we need. And when we were using Talk, I was reading the Talk kernel code and imagining like, oh no, what mechanism am I going to have to build into here to turn off the dynamic program loading? Because it is possible to do a remote code execution exploit without dynamic program loading, but boy, it sure is easier if there's an API for it.
Right. Well, and James, it goes to your point too about talking about how the kind of self-hosting, viewing self-hosting as a constraint of an operating system kind of guides you to building an operating system designed to compile other things. It's not actually, Hubris will never be self-hosting, virtually tautologically. And that is a total non-goal.
I mean, I'm definitely tempted to say challenge accepted in response to that.
That's right.
It's certainly not intended to be self-hosted.
It's not intended to be self-hosted. Yeah, exactly. But so that kind of, as you say, it's that cheat clip where we are really taking our design for application, namely a deeply embedded system, and then that realization then unlocks, I think, a bunch of things. So Adam, you were asking about the origin of humility. I had been building some debugging support for Talk. You and I both were working on Talkalator.
Talkalator.
RIP Talkalator.
That's right.
So where we were taking, because when you run when you synthesize RISC-V and Verilator will give you a complete instruction trace. And I'm like, this is gold. We should be using this. No one in the Talk community or OpenTitan community is really using this. We use the instruction traces to actually show code flow, use it to actually debug a real problem, which was very gratifying. So that was kind of my entree into debugging Hubris. And I think to a certain degree, that kind of overcorrected me because, Cliff, you'll remember we were really focused on like ETM early. And the ETM is the embedded trace macro cell in Cortex parts. So it turns out it's not in the M7. It's only in the M4. And I'm not sure which variants include ETM. But I was kind of starting with the idea of like, wow, we really need instruction traces because that's what had been useful in Talk. You know, it was kind of fighting the last war in that regard. But then seeing what Cliff had done, and then Laura, you were starting to develop, I mean, you were effectively the first Hubris developer, if I recall correctly. And you were starting to actually develop Hubris code for the LPC55. Is that a correct recollection?
Yeah, so I think I ended up, the initial port for Hubris was done on the STM chip, and then I think about that point we had like finally decided, I think pretty concretely, that we were going to be going with the LPC55, and so I ended up just sort of picking it up just because no one had done it yet, just sort of as an experiment to try and get it going. This was also actually the first port just to go from ARMv7 on the STM chip to the ARMv8M on the LPC55. So this was also an experiment to see about how hard it would be to deal with quirks like that. And it turned out to be pretty easy so far.
And you were then developing, whether it was the SPI support that you were developing early. I'm trying to remember, you were developing something early. And I remember like asking myself the question, like, what is going to be helpful to Laura as she's developing this? I don't know if you remember this, Laura, but me asking you, like, would it be helpful to have like a task listing, for example?
Yeah, I think I did a lot of initial drivers kind of speculatively just to try and get it after the initial, blinking LED type thing to try and figure out what exactly, just to try and I think even get to learn about what the LPC55 was in there and figure out how to make it work. So.
And so I remember asking you, like, would that be useful? You'd be like, that seems like that would be useful. So I'm like, all right, so I'm going to now use this great cheat that Cliff has of us knowing the entire system. And what does it look like to actually get, because we know everything about the system. So with actually very little cooperation from the target system, we can understand what tasks are doing, for example.
This is also about the history of debugging is that, you know, we mentioned GDB before. I think also previously our debugging option was semi-hosting to be able to get print output, and that was pretty slow on some of the targets, which I think was annoying you to no end. I was okay with it. It was actually long after humility was out, but
yeah, so semi-hosting. I mean, God bless semi-hosting. It's important. Cliff,
it's also just literally too slow when you're trying stuff. So like, as somebody who's new to this, I remember when I was trying to turn one of the I2C driver to be interrupt driven, and I'd use semi-hosting for my initial like printout stuff to exactly debug it. And it's like, cool, it works. Let me remove all the semi-hosting stuff, and then I remove it, and it wouldn't work anymore. I'm like, oh no! And it's because the timing of the waiting for the semi-hosting made it work appropriately. So it's like a problem also, even if it's not like just a preference. I guess that's what I learned anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, Simi, go ahead.
I wanted to point out that I get the impression that stuff like semi-hosting is the kind of things that people who are coming down the stack towards embedded systems are like, yeah, that's nice. We can have nice things. Let's have something like that. Whereas I don't know. It's like I've read some embedded programming books, and like the common wisdom is you have a UART, and that is how you interact with your system. Like,
absolutely.
Or you blink an LED.
You know, it's also that debuggers in embedded systems are built by people who don't believe debuggers work, and therefore tautologically they don't work.
I enthusiastically agree with that.
And like, you know, if anyone has ever tried to bring up like JTAG debug, you're probably on Windows, you've got Eclipse running, you're crossing your fingers that all this like tower of vendor babble is attached to a random ST micro JTAG adapter, which may or may not be trustworthy. It's really a complete nightmare, and will probably take you longer than, you know, hand inspecting every line of your code to get working.
So you were reminding me of one of several holes that Oxide nearly fell in, or arguably did fall in. The on-chip debugger is a separate chip. Effectively, it's got its own firmware that you use to debug the target system. And these things are even the ones that are putatively open leave quite a bit to be desired. And hey, Cliff, maybe it's still our fate to design our own, because I feel like we came super close to. I just remember a period where we got so frustrated with the stuff that's out there. Cliff, actually, would you mind actually giving people just letting them know how semi-hosting works? Because I think that, and what semi-hosting is.
Yeah, so semi-hosting is an amazing hack perpetrated by Keel, which is a tools company that ARM now owns. And it is an answer to the question of, I've got this embedded system, and I've got this debug link to it over JTAG or SWD, which is ARM's debug serial protocol. And I would like to blank. I'd like to run some unit tests maybe and get the output from them. Or, you know, maybe I just would like my printfs or, you know, print lines to come out somewhere. So what they've done is, one of the things that a debugger, when it's attached to a chip like this, can do is halting debug. It can notice if the chip reaches certain points or satisfies certain conditions and stop the program. And in particular on ARM, like on most instruction sets, there's a breakpoint instruction that you can insert. So semi-hosting is a protocol in the sense, not in the network sense, but in the sense of a set of agreements and rules that your embedded software and the debug tools follow to allow breakpoints to serve kind of like system calls. So your program executes a breakpoint that is formatted in a special way that your debugger on your laptop recognizes and says, oh, this breakpoint, it's not really a breakpoint, this is a printf. I'm going to look at the machine registers and figure out where the block being sent is and then print it to the screen and then resume the program. So this is cool not only because it's kind of a ridiculous hack, it's also cool because you can use it on a system when you have nothing attached to it other than like 3 wires of debug connection, which is nice. maybe all of your UARTs are tied up doing product things and can't be used for printf debugging. But it's also nice because it's almost entirely independent of the chip. Your semi-hosting code will work on an ARM Cortex chip made by essentially anyone. You don't need to know the clock frequency it's running at. You don't even need to know if the clock is stable necessarily, which you do for a UART. So it can be really enabling. The downside is that, as people have mentioned, it's super slow because the whole processor has to come to a screeching halt, wait for your laptop to go out over USB and notice that it halted, and then go and slurp some data out of its memory, and then tell it to start again, and then your software runs a little bit longer and then does another print call. So it's not perfect, but it works surprisingly well for how weird it sounds.
It's the opposite of a turbo button, right? It's like,
it is, yes. It is the opposite of a turbo button. It is also, like, honestly, I think it's essential. I mean, it's a very good little facility. Do not leave it on in shipping code, though, because if you do an hprintln in shipping code, it will stop. Like, the target has no way of knowing that, oh, by the way, like, we're on a balloon or we are been deployed in a deeply embedded context. Like, if we stop, there's no JTAG header here even. Like, there's nobody can unstop us.
Yeah, if you're really lucky, you can get the processor to deliver a debug monitor exception, but you have to do some setup to make that work. Out of the box, semi-hosting will just halt your CPU if there's nothing attached, which is unfortunate. It is unfortunate, and it is undebuggable. So which is obviously challenges with semi-hosting. But I mean, honestly, and also a strange name. Although, Cliff, the way you gave such a good explanation of the history there, that the name semi-hosting almost made sense in your. It's definitely a bizarre name. Well, it's derived from the concept of hosting your software on your workstation during development, so that it can reach out through an emulator or whatever and do, read test vectors from the file system or what have you. So semi-hosting is halfway to that. It's running parts of the code on your workstation and parts of the code on the embedded processor. Right. Yeah, there you go. So I guess it does make sense. And there's a faster way to, instead of actually stopping the CPU, there's something called ITM, with the instrumentation trace macro cell, which is much faster, but is also lossy, which is a huge problem. One thing that's great about semi-hosting is it's not lossy. Like, you stop, and you're pretty much guaranteed that if you have semi-hosting output, you're going to see it, whereas you are not guaranteed for ITM output. I am really concerned that I've just dropped. Have I dropped? Am I still here?
You're still here. You're still here.
Okay.
You're here.
yeah.
It's just that all the rest of us are gone.
No, Twitter Spaces is doing that thing that it likes to do, where they think, what if I just freeze everybody for right now?
Oh, did you plug in a headset by any chance?
That's right. That's right. Now I'm plugging in a headset. But so we were looking at ITM, which was, and we are using ITM. That's part of how we got to the wanting to go down our own debugger path, because the ITM support is really not great. But to me, like, it was clear that we could be much more valuable by understanding the system at large and be able to show you much larger context. And there are a couple of key moments in this. One, Cliff, was like what you did with respect to the archive, and just the amount of things that the system knows about itself that are in the archive that we don't have to load. Yeah, we haven't documented that anywhere, so it might be worth unpacking that, so to speak. Yeah, please. So the Hubris build system produces a thingy at the end, a thingy that contains the firmware that you can use to flash another thingy. But the details of the thingy are kind of important. So rather than simply producing like a binary image that gets blown into Flash, or an ELF binary that is basically a binary image plus a bunch of metadata, we realized early on that, so our build process produces one ELF file per task, and then another one for the kernel. And that's important because we keep those around because they have the debug symbols in them. And you can't really merge the debug symbols between tasks because they're memory isolated. So if they both declare a static variable called X, they're separate
variables called X. They are not the same, which is, important. So we were dealing with these collections of ELF files, and we did what I think a lot of people in software in the past 20 years have wound up doing is say, gosh, wouldn't it be more convenient if this was all one file? So the output of the Hubris build system is actually a zip file now that contains a well-defined directory structure with all of our task ELF files, the kernel ELF file, but also the configuration files that were used to drive the build system. And soon the interface definitions for all the IPC messages that can be sent in the system. So you wind up with this one file that you can hand to the flashing tool or to Humility that contains the entire state of the system that you might need to interpret, independent of any versioning concerns. And this is really nice because imagine if you had to rebuild your debugger for different versions of your firmware so that it could pull in different interface definitions. That would be super annoying. And having a build archive that we can slip sort of arbitrary metadata into keeps us from needing to do this. And then Brian did something kind of weird with the Humility core dump support, where the core dump support blows out an ELF file that looks like a core file on a Unix system. But in one of the sections of the ELF file, he stuffs the build archive. So if your field tech sends you a core dump from the embedded processor, you can feed this to the debugger. The debugger can take it apart, pull out the build archive, and be confident that it's using the right symbol set for the right version of the firmware that the tech was interacting with. So you can't get that wrong, which is nice.
It is nice. It's kind of weird, but it's nice. Isn't it nice?
It's kind of weird, but like so is semi-hosting and semi-hosting.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, right. Okay, yeah, I should.
It is not that weird in particular because how many times at Sun, back in the ancient times, Brian, did we spend time trying to sync up a crash dump with a particular set of source files?
I'm so confused right now.
That's because
I feel like that was a child trolling.
That was unfortunately, Adam, you and I, we try to be HA in the respect that one of us is not dealing with a parenting situation at any given moment. And you had an unmuted parenting situation, but I had a muted parenting situation at exactly the same moment. So yeah, exactly. So Cloudnic, drive.
It's also, I mean, it's not weird to eventually end up with a file that's totally not a zip file that's actually a zip file. Like this has happened in almost every project I've ever worked on. Like literally cargo packages are like a .crate file that's like, oops, it's secretly a zip file. So it's just like what always happens eventually. You want a bunch of things to be one thing, so you make a zip file out of it.
Well, and you can also see that with Java jar files or secretly zip files, and so is every GIF file that I receive from a security job applicant.
And I think like once we started putting things in the build archive, I feel like a bunch of other things that suddenly
there's a lot of things.
There's a lot of
many
things. Yeah. So you want to elaborate on that, Steve? Because I think it's actually we've now used it as a way of solving a bunch of things.
This is the thing that I found super interesting, again, coming from more higher level things and then kind of doing this professionally for the first time, is like there's a lot of people complain about Rust binary sizes, for example, and a lot of that is because they use ls instead of the tool that like actually says how much code there is, because we include a lot of debug info. And so, there's kind of this split between the stuff that's actually in your files versus what goes on the device. And so we're able to include all of this rich debugging information, that, like you already said, individually in these files that are in the zip files. That way it doesn't go on your device, but you're able to look it up separately. I think that's definitely really cool. Small shout out to Windows, where this is the way it works all the time. You have a separate file with the debug info instead of putting it in the binary. So that's a whole separate thing. But just in general, yeah, there's like all the tasks individually. There's like a text file that represents the memory map. There's like a couple other random things, but it's just been super useful to be like, yeah, are you ever going to need this later? Shove it in the zip file. It's not going on the device anyway. It'll be really easy to check out later.
So as long as you're on the point of Windows, actually, Steve, could you elaborate on that a little bit? Because actually one of the things that was super interesting to me about having used Rust for all of this stuff is that you at first, but are by no means the only person at Oxide. I saw Nathaniel here earlier. I know Nathaniel and a lot of the double E's have to use Windows because there's tooling that's only available there for them. We kind of got the Windows support for free for all of this tooling, which to me, I still kind of marvel at.
So when I joined, Hubris didn't build on Windows because Brian had used string concatenation in one place instead of the actual path.
Jesus
API.
Christ, that is so personalized.
That was it. That was honest. No. What I'm saying is, this is an important point. Like, you were like, I would never, if I wrote some C code, I would not expect to run it on Windows in the first time. But it was literally like only one thing. Like, I think it had like a 6-character diff or something, and then it all just worked on Windows. Like, I'm saying it's minimal. I'm not trying to call you out. I'm saying like you almost 100% got it correct by accident. And so like, that's like part of the thing. I've been using Windows for the last 5 or 6 years because I used to joke it's like the more hipster option. And at this point, Microsoft has reformed their image to the point where maybe that's not actually literally true anymore. But I sort of showed up being the only Windows user on the Hubris team at the time anyway. We had more people sort of like join and also using Hubris and so Oxide. And like 99% of it just absolutely worked. Has continued to mostly just work. Honestly, the most annoying thing about using Windows is Hubris, not Hubris itself, but the fact that GitHub Actions is so slow for freaking Windows builds that's like the only thing that's actually kind of an annoyance.
I disagree with you on that. I think the core annoyance is that Windows and to a lesser degree Mac are the operating systems we interact with that don't have package managers. So
yeah, that's fair too. But we've almost killed almost all that. There's only one. If we just need to get rid of this dependency on what is it, NM or something? I forget what it is.
Or something. Yeah.
There's one tool, and then it'll just be all the Rust tool chain, and it'll be totally fine. But yeah, like stuff totally works on Windows, and it's also interesting and weird coming from that perspective because so much of embedded seems to be only on Windows. Like, there's a lot of people. When you hear embedded stuff on Hacker News, people are like, oh, well, does this even work on Windows? And people are like, are you kidding? Like, a lot of the embedded stuff is like Windows only, actually, because vendors give you this code that's like, well, we support it on Windows and that's it. Like, so it just sort of depends. But we're lucky to have a really good cross-platform development story. And, for the most part, it just works, other than the couple dependencies we haven't finally killed yet.
It's pretty remarkable how well it works. And in the path separator issue that you're highlighting, I mean, again, I feel very deeply personalized, of course.
It's good.
I mean, honestly, Rust could not have done any more to try to get me to use the platform independent separator, and I insisted on doing the wrong thing. Basically, I just didn't know about it. Actually, I didn't realize that they had abstracted that. And as you say, actually, it did not even occur to me that this is going to be the one thing. I kind of had that feeling of like, well, there's going to be lots of other reasons we don't work on Windows. It won't be the path. If the path separators are a problem, give me a call. It's like, okay, here we are with a call.
Even then, Humility, which was entirely your own code base at that point, I think, worked perfectly. Like, it was literally just one small bug in Hubris. And other than that, total cross-platform, no big deal.
That happened to be introduced by Brian. Yeah, we get it.
I'm also going to say that if you told me it went off without a hitch, I would not have believed you. I now believe you.
Right, exactly. No, it's been great, and again, Nathaniel was in the lab as we were doing a bunch of of Hubris and Humility work together, and along with doing a bunch of FPGA work, and it's just it didn't even occur to me that Cliff, you and I were building on Linux, and he was building on Windows, and everything was just kind of working, which was remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, he'd build on Windows and flash from there onto the product, and then take a core dump and send it to us, and we're on our Linux laptops, taking it apart and then sending a patch back, and I don't know, it just wasn't no big thing.
It was not a big deal, which was amazing.
The bug reports that we're getting, most of our platform support issues now are actually on Mac. They're adamant into this. There appears to be a class of Rust installs on Macs that I think might be a result of mixing the package managers that are distributed for macOS, where it looks like Rust Up and Cargo are speaking the same language, but they're secretly not. So you get version mismatch, and I don't understand it. But we had another report come in.
It's insidious, and I never understood it. I just started deleting files that were dated 2016 until it worked.
Yeah.
But it did work. You ultimately got it working, it sounds like.
Yeah. I got it working, but it was Cargo would say it would run one version, it would promise it would run one version, and it would run something completely different. It was bizarre.
That is really annoying. That's not nice at all. So a couple of things. Also, like Cargo X Task, I feel has done a lot of lifting for us. I mean, I don't know, Cliff or Steve, you want to talk about like how we've used Xtask, and because I think that's been
this is a bunch of stuff I did, so I guess I'll talk about it and save Cliff the time. So basically, there's this pattern called Xtask that Matt Clad, who's the primary force behind the Rust Analyzer project, had developed, and basically it's just like an easy way for you to write essentially build scripts in Rust proper and have Cargo be able to use them. So there's a bunch of tools that kind of layer additional state on top of Cargo, like just and Cargo make and all these things. But you have to install them before you can get going, which is kind of an extra step that's sort of annoying. And so Xtask is kind of this pattern that sort of abuses this Cargo alias functionality to let you kind of like write custom scripts inside your project and then they can get executed. So instead of writing Cargo build, you write Cargo Xtask build, and now you have a fully scriptable environment around your build or whatever. And so a lot of the early work that I did on Hubris is like moving stuff into this kind of direction, and also just in general, I don't know, improving the build system stuff. But that's kind of basically the idea. And so it's not as fully featured as like a make clone would actually be. It pretty much just drops you into a function main, and you have to write up your own thing. But it does mean that you can script additional things. And since we're building an entire OS with all the tasks being built separately and the kernel being built separately and then assembling them all together, Cargo on its own just really doesn't cut it because that was not really designed. It's designed to build, you know, one library and binaries, not like an entire OS all at once. So there has to be some sort of layer on top of it.
And Steve, importantly, when you say scriptable, you mean scriptable in Rust. I mean, scriptable.
Sure,
we're
totally.
writing Rust programs to build the system, and it has made it really easy to extend the system, I think. And it's been really nice to actually have your build system be built as part of your system is really nice, actually.
I cut a section about this from my talk when I learned that I had 10 minutes fewer than they said I did. But I've tried to do this in C projects, and C projects, if I can make generalizations, have, I think, a very healthy fear of doing this, to the point that, like, if you look at OpenSSL, their build system and generation stuff is in Perl. And it's in Perl because people probably already have Perl. Perl doesn't have to be compiled, so you don't have to invoke the build system to figure out how to run the build system effectively. And Cargo managed to do this really well, to the point that having Cargo responsible for building a bunch of tools that then are responsible for running the build system that calls into Cargo to build your other code kind of just works without really thinking about it. And I've had to write build systems in previous jobs, and the fact that they got this right without conflicts or like surprise, I built your library for the wrong target architecture is pretty cool, actually. And it was really enabling.
It was very cool. I personally had no idea how any of that worked. I don't know, like, okay, I just run like Cargo Xtask dist. Like I knew what to type, but I had zero idea what was going on. And then I needed to go extend it in some way. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Like, we actually generate, and then you go into it, you're like, wait a minute, this all just works? Like, this seems so complicated, and it all just seems to be working. It was amazing.
For the main Rust compiler, we do the same thing, except for it's Python instead of Perl because it's 2021 instead of 1995. I say with my Perl tattoo, rip Perl. But like, yeah, like you need something to get it started, but then it's like not a big deal. And so it's definitely a little unwieldy in the sense that you have to kind of to invent the universe, but also you get to do whatever you want, which is not true for most of Cargo, and so that's helpful. I still think there's a bunch of things that could be made a lot better with it, but it just kind of, it is what it is. I don't know.
Yeah, that's been pretty great, honestly. And I feel like it's been another one of these things that I feel we've used more and more rather than less and less. I feel we have seen kind of more and more opportunity. I mean, Rick, the stuff that you did with the task slots, I feel like really began to leverage all of this and getting out of kind of that, you know, in part being cross-platform also necessitates this, but getting out from underneath calling kind of random utilities to do things as part of the build and doing all of that effectively in Rust has been really powerful, I think.
Yeah, so, when I started implementing task slot, it was one of those interesting periods where I was like, wait, I can do things by packing it into special linker segments. But that means that I have to go write the other side that actually parses these files. and does things with it. And then I looked at the Xtask stuff again and went, oh, wait, we already have whole frameworks that deal with parsing these things. It's actually really trivial now. So, it's kind of that whole thing of, because of us leveraging that pattern and using existing Rust libraries to deal with parsing ELF and dwarf information and things, it suddenly becomes a lot easier to build more intricate tools for more special purposes.
Yeah, and we have leaned on the dwarf information heavily, which has been, I mean, honestly, and Steve, remind me that there's basically a single individual that is responsible for the quality of dwarf information that Rust emits, and boy, am I grateful for it.
It's definitely very close to, it's like maybe 1 or 1.5 people that do a lot of that work, and so it's just classically true in open source. There's always like one person somewhere who's doing all the stuff in that one niche that you actually need to rely on. So it's definitely super helpful.
And it could be, I mean, I actually, honestly, when I went into the dwarf support, I kind of thought like, well, there's going to be a lot of stuff that's just missing here because it just isn't generally important in most projects. And dwarf is weird, and there's like definitely weird dwarfisms that one has to deal with. But basically, there's a lot of information there that we're able to use in lots and lots and lots of different ways that are, and I feel like especially when you kind of accept that as a new constraint, that like I know the dwarf information is going to be there when I'm building my debugging infrastructure or what have you, then there are a bunch of things that become possible or easy even.
Yeah, the most stuff that we run into that's a problem, and not we in the Hubris humility sense, but we in the Rust sense, is that dwarf was definitely designed for like the C ecosystem, and so representing Rust concepts in dwarf sometimes can be confusing in my understanding. Like it's not like it has native understanding of what a trait is, for example. So you kind of got to do some stuff, but it works, and it's better than nothing.
All I can say there is thank goodness for Ada, because not really. The dwarf representation that Rust uses to describe data-bearing enums with fields is support that was added to the dwarf standard for Ada, which got something vaguely similar in 1983. And so it uses all the terminology, like variant part keeps appearing in the dwarf standard without explanation.
Yes,
that's an Ada standard term.
Oh, that is so good to know. That's so good to know, because I was having those same positive feelings that someone came first, and I was having to ascribe those to C++, which was leaving me with very complicated feelings of like, I think I'm grateful for C++ here, but it's such a relief to be able to move those over to Ada, which I feel not conflicted at all about. But those are so Cliff, those are the data-bearing enums, which are so important in Rust. That's an Ada-ism. I did not realize that.
Well, so the way they're expressed in dwarf is an Ada-ism.
Right.
So Ada has variant records, which are kind of like Rust enums, but are different in ways that we can go into if you're really bored. But they're not exactly the same thing, but it did mean that the Rust team was able to reuse the existing definitions in dwarf and not have to like add their own extensions to the dwarf standard to represent enums, which is fantastic.
Well, God bless it, because that then became super helpful for when, as we were, developing Hubris tasks. And one of the things that I personally wanted was and that I feel like I've coded up a gazillion times in kernel development, is a quick little ring buffer where you're storing data into a memory buffer that is going to be circular, that you're going to deliberately overwrite, and it's effectively an event log of the last n things I'm interested in, and kind of the realization that like, wait a minute, I can actually use data-bearing enums for this and use the dwarf information to parse it, and now I can make it super quick to go sprinkle a couple of ring buff entries in some code of interest and be able to debug it. That to me was like a big light going on in terms of like, wow, this is actually really powerful.
Yeah, the ability to derive a debug instance in system for a complicated enum type, or to do a similar pretty printing of a complicated enum type through the dwarf information, means that you have this opportunity to use types defined in Rust as a user interface mechanism. Types that you may never actually parse in the application, you're writing them into a ring buffer purely so they can be printed by the debugger. And this is a thing that would be very difficult to pull off without dynamic dispatch or dynamic allocation in a language that did not have Rust style sum types or data bearing enums.
Yeah, it is. It's tremendously valuable, and I think it also gets to another thing that I think has been a valuable decision, not necessarily by fiat. It's like it would, in principle, be possible to support tasks not in Rust, but as you, I think, is in your phraseology, early Cliff, it's a non-goal. And one of the things that is a goal is Rust for tasks as well as for the kernel. And being able to kind of assume that we've got Rust everywhere allows us to build abstractions that I think are more powerful and allows us to develop the system faster.
Well, and to go in a big circle, that actually brings me to one of the issues that we ran into with Talk that caused us not to pursue Talk further, was that at the time, Talk didn't have userland support for Rust. They wrote their programs that ran in unprivileged mode in C. They used Rust for the kernel and wrote their drivers in Rust, in safe Rust, through some stuff that they do. And that wasn't really what we wanted to do, because we knew the bulk of our code was going to be in tasks, and we wanted to write that code in a memory safe language because life is too short to debug pointer problems all the time. And it's like, I want to limit my comparisons to Fuchsia as well, but it's interesting to note that Fuchsia has exactly the opposite combination. Fuchsia uses memory unsafe languages only in the privileged TCB and allows for memory unsafe language, or allows for memory safe languages like Rust in processes that run outside of the kernel. And this was literally the first thing I asked my boss about after I joined the team. And they have their reasons, but we wanted to do something different because the kernel seems like the last place that I want to have memory unsafety problems.
They have
yeah.
their reasons sounds like a very charitable take. Or,
it is a very
diplomatic.
Well, do you know what? Do you know Cliff is a very charitable person? He's also a very diplomatic person. It may surprise you to learn.
I mean, I actually think that, I mean, it's like I mentioned early on in this conversation that I designed Hubris in part because of the people we had around. You know, you design a system that your engineers can work on. And I think Fuchsia to some degree did the same thing. And that's not an unreasonable choice to have made. It's just not the choice we made here.
Yeah, interesting. So, Cliff, I want maybe to get to some of the things that we see, the kind of the big next problems in Hubris. Certainly, you're working on one of them right now that I'm personally very excited about, that maybe you want to expand on a little bit.
So, due to a misunderstanding early on in the design of Hubris, I thought that someone at Oxide, possibly Brian, I honestly don't remember, because like Hubris, it started right at the beginning of the pandemic, so like my memory is all scrambled. But I thought somebody really hated IDLs, interface description languages, these languages that people use to define like RPC message formats between programs. So Hubris didn't have one. I wanted to see how far I could get just using the Rust type system to model messages. And the answer is you can get pretty far, but modeling the messages isn't actually the part that hurts. It's generating, or it's writing client and server stubs for handling messages and making sure that they all check the right error paths and look at the right codes and things like that so that you don't introduce bugs. So we just hired Matt Keeter recently, and he was approaching the project with fresh eyes and said, hey, if I want to start a server, do I need to copy all this boilerplate? He said very diplomatically. And I said,
sorry.
Yeah, sorry. And we got to talking about it. So now we're doing an IDL so that we can generate client and server stubs to make writing tasks easier. And that's coming along well.
Cliff, I would like to say that I would like to praise you in contrast to Adam for you think it only may have been me disparaging IDLs, whereas Adam would have said with absolute confidence, no, we were in an argument and you shouted me down over using IDLs. When I don't think I've been anti-IDL. Adam, have I been anti-IDL? I'm just, because this has given me a complex that I am like, that I have like somehow anti-IDL.
Oh,
I
you don't
didn't think it
remember?
was
No,
you.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, I don't remember you being anti-IDL. I'm not going to chalk you, throw you under that bus.
So one of the really awkward things about using humans as code generators instead of computers is that we all come into our jobs carrying all of our scars and trauma from all of our past jobs and the rest of our life, right? So I'm honestly not even sure that this conflict happened at I may have come into this job like with scars from a previous IDL argument 15 years ago that then manifested, right? It's really tough.
This reminds me of my mother had a coworker that was just being absolutely vicious to her for reasons she couldn't figure out. She's like, I think I must look like his ex-wife or something. I feel like we have that a lot where we have something that reminds us of a past trauma and then we don't actually. Anyway, I hope it wasn't me.
Well,
I'd like to say for the record, I'm pro IDL. I'm super excited about this IDL, which is very on brand with Cliff, has got a terrific name. Cliff, you want to do the reveal?
Well, so I don't think it's that funny, but so Hubris has an unofficial mascot, becoming gradually more official. So after I named the project, I was looking for an icon for the chat channel at work. So I went and found a picture of a broken statue, which was referencing the Percy Bysshe Shelley poem Ozymandias about, the grandiose claims of a long dead king. So Ozzy is our bot that does reformattings and stuff.
And you have to say what it says when it does the reformatting.
Oh yeah, so the commit message when it reformats your code is "look upon my reformat and despair" in all caps, which is great because its commits are like the most worthless thing.
It did until earlier today when I killed it in humility, and we'll kill it in hubris tomorrow morning. But yes,
right.
One more day of those commits happening.
Because we had a bug where apparently in the all public world there are things that now broke where that used to work, and in particular it was doing these commits to the wrong repo, which I love that even more. That it's actually doing the wrong branch.
The wrong repo. It was doing them on the wrong branch. So someone would send us a PR. And Ozzy would try to commit to their branch, be denied, and like throw a fit and go mess up some other branch. Just
I look upon my works ye mighty and despair.
And despair, exactly. All caps, like wrong branch. I just feel like God. It just felt it all felt very poetic. So Ozymandias, I will miss your commits.
Well, so actually, the IDL is in reference to Ozymandias is called idol, IDOL, and the repo is called idolatry, because I have this habit of using slightly disparaging terms for projects.
And it's the false idol of the IDL. It's good. I think it's going to be, and I think is going to leverage a bunch of the stuff that we've done. And and Cliff, maybe this is actually good, because the other thing I want to just touch on briefly, I'm not sure if this is another thing, it was in like the missing minutes of your Hubris talk, but the power of BuildRS is something that took me a while to appreciate.
It is, in fact, in the missing minutes of the talk. So, where to start? One of the things that I really like about the Rust ecosystem is that it tends to be very pragmatic. And I realize that probably sounds ridiculous to C programmers looking at Rust and all of its moving parts, but Rust has 3 ways of doing code generation. There's the macro rules, kind of matchy macros that are written right there in a source file. That was the original thing that shipped with the language. And then there are sort of the so-called right way of doing code generation is the proc macros that can derive traits automatically for your structs, which, side note, is probably the #1 thing I would miss if I had to go back to C++ right now. But then there's this build.rs file, and build.rs file has been around since the 1.0 release or before, and it looks like a weird afterthought kind of thing. It's like the gist of it is you can provide this file that Cargo will build and run before building your project, which sounds silly, or like, is this a security problem, or things like that. But fundamentally, this is the equivalent of putting some shell commands in your makefile in a C program, except that you can have dependencies on external packages. You can have your build script pull in SERDI and read some files formatted in JSON and then like gzip compress them into a binary that it deposits into the build directory where your project can pull it in as an array. It's just incredibly powerful and totally unstructured. So there's a few cases where we're using build.rs files to do various kinds of code generation or paper over things that we're doing that Cargo didn't see coming. For example, Cargo has this notion of features that you can turn on and off that provide sort of a limited form of conditional compilation. In embedded context, it's incredibly common to need effectively features with values. Like, you need to define something to tell which board you're targeting, and you don't want a Boolean for every board. You want a name and possibly 3 different names for like the processor type and the board model and the revision. And so you can actually do that from a build.rs, and we do.
And that was that was kind of my entree to build.rs. I'm like, all right, this is just some file I've got to go edit, some boilerplate to be able to get board definitions. I guess I didn't really appreciate what it did at all. And then, Cliff, you had turned me onto it when I was doing some code generation for PM Bus. You're like, you may want to look into this. And then, like, holy God, I can do forget proc macros. I can do whatever I want and create whatever source I want. I don't know if you played around with build.rs. I mean, it's just like it is amazing.
And you can do, you really can. You could like read in the whole source tree and make some decisions based on other source files.
And you can do something that I think, Cliff, you were making allusion to, although implicitly, you can like take an FPGA bitstream and compress it and actually then deposit it in a binary that it can be then included in by your Rust program, which is how
that's the thing we're literally doing, right? So
that's what we're literally doing, yeah.
The firmware for our server board picks up an FPGA bitstream, which will eventually be built from RTL, but right now it's checked in as a bitstream, and builds a crate implementing a simple compression algorithm for your host architecture, usually Intel, although less so with time, and deposits the result of that into the source tree. The firmware files then include that using Rust include bytes directive, which is really nice.
Amazing. Include bytes is so amazing. Include bytes, include str are amazing.
And then the firmware depends on that same crate, but Cargo knows to build the crate for your target embedded architecture when the firmware references it. So the build.rs and the firmware are using the same crate to sort of pass data between them in a compressed form, which is super handy and would have been a giant pain to do in most other build systems.
It is remarkable, and then we'll leverage you're leveraging all that same stuff for idolatry, right? For taking these idle files and being able to generate.
The way that you generate code is you have your build script depend on the idle crate, and it just calls in and says, I would like you to generate me a server stub, and please put it here, and then you include it from your source file.
And then the actual definition itself is in RON, right? The Rust object notation, which is there are definitely some things about it that I definitely like. I think at some point we're going to have to improve the error messages.
We're going to have to rewrite the parser at some point. It probably won't stay in RON, to be honest. So we're at a stage in the project where we're iterating rapidly. We don't know what information needs to be present in the interface definitions yet. We're still learning. I'm porting all of our existing IPC interfaces over to this to sort of learn how I did it wrong. And during that stage, it's really nice to be able to iterate by only updating the data structures, the structs and enums and whatnot that you've got in the code generator, and then use SERDI to load them from files. So right now, our IDL files are just data structures expressed in currently RON that we load with SERDI to be structs in Rust and then manipulate. And this is fantastic for iterating, but it does mean that, like every other case nowadays where you've got a configuration file stuffed into somebody else's meta syntax like JSON or YAML increasingly, it means it's never quite right. It doesn't feel quite right. And so I suspect eventually we're going to want a parser. But for now, being able to just pull a crate off the shelf and parse complex data structures is hugely enabling. And like Ron itself is popular in the Rust game engine community for doing asset definitions and engine configuration. So it's getting a lot of attention from there. But it also has a bad habit of failing in ways that say line 0, column 0. And I don't know why that is, but I haven't gotten in to fix it yet.
I feel that an error message should say like, "Hey, you might as well start commenting out half your run," and it's like because that's
that
what you
is
have to
my
do.
development process. Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Moving the comment characters around until it stops failing.
But Ron has comment characters. God bless it. So
it does. Yep.
There's a lot to be said for it. So that's going to be exciting. That's going to, and then we can also once we actually have, we know. Oh, by the way, this task has this interface definition. We can leverage all of the things that we have built to then say, oh, so now if I see a message from, say, the debugger, from Humility, from this task to that task, I actually know how to interpret it, and I can actually show it to you, and which is something that I've always wanted. I mean, haven't we all, the ability to see these messages?
Message trace with pretty specifically, and having all of the IDL definitions in the build archive means that in theory, once we finish this mechanism, you can hand the build archive to Humility and have it pretty print messages it's never heard of before that exist in your application, which is really hot. It's also worth noting that, like, per the wheel of reincarnation that constantly turns in our industry, when I joined Fuchsia, they were solving this same problem for their system. And they did it in a really nice way that's different from what we're doing. But I just think it's interesting that we're building the same thing. Does the hand icon on somebody mean someone raising a hand?
Yeah, it means Simeon, go for it. He's got a question.
So this is a question which is kind of like I've heard a phrase mentioned in a few occasions by Oxide folks, you, Brian, and one or two other occasions. That is hardware, software co-design. And if I hadn't heard that phrase 19 odd years ago, I would have thought, oh, that means, we have a small team, we don't have big silos, we have our hardware and software people work together, smart move, okay, done, move on. Hang in there, this has got something to do with code generation, but I happen to have heard of that phrase 19 years ago. And the connection there was a series of papers that came out of a research group at Berkeley who did work on basically the idea that you model your entire system, perhaps software, hardware, your RTL for your FPGAs or whatever, and then you have like this big button that you press in this amazing software suite that generates all your code for you. Now, that's not something that I think necessarily was going to work or would work, but and there's an interesting story arc that kind of connects these things together. And they called that co-design. But I'm kind of curious, when Oxide folks say that, what do they mean?
It probably differs for each of us. You should separate us into separate rooms and ask us individually just to make sure.
So you're suggesting he take the microkernel approach like Fuchsia?
Right, exactly. Well played. I also feel that, like Cliff, now I've got like each of us in our own interrogation room and be like, no, I'm not going to tell you what hardware. It's like Leventhal already told us everything. We actually already know it all. We just want to confirm that you guys. Yeah. So.
I mean, you just.
Yeah. I mean.
Yeah. Cliff, go ahead, give your answer to this. I'm very curious on your answer to this. I've got certainly my own, but I'd love to hear your perspective.
I mean, this is going to sound like every Cliff answer ever, but it really depends on what you mean. So it's a spectrum, yada yada. No, what we are doing concretely, call it co-design or not, what we are doing is closer to the first thing that you said. We have the same people concerned with software and hardware. We are hiring hardware-fluent software people when possible and software-fluent hardware people when possible, and making sure everybody talks to each other in their own organizational boundaries so that we can make compromises across the software and hardware stacks to make the product better, rather than say, having the hardware platform handed to you and you have to write the software for it. We can make a better product if we can do that in both directions. Back annotate in if I can abuse some schematic terms, from the software back to the hardware, and that produces a better product. I'm also familiar with the sort of academic end of co-design that you're referencing, and the notion that you could have some sort of common modeling language or system and have a machine decide where to draw the lines is compelling. You know, it sounds great. I worry that, I mean, we've gotten very good at teaching machines to do massive scale applied statistics, which is what most of what people call machine learning actually is. And the thing that the machines tend to be kind of bad at is the intuitive leap. And I feel like one of the things that we can contribute as engineers based on experience and resonance with each other and different backgrounds and stuff is even just the decision on where to draw that seam between the hardware and software, even if everything was generated other than that, I think is incredibly powerful and can make the difference between a product that works and a product that doesn't.
Yeah, so one of the purported benefits of the code, let's call it the Berkeley definition of hardware software co-design, is this idea that you simulate your entire system and then you have new knowledge and you use that new knowledge to partition. So you decide, you know, this part of the data path we're going to do in software, this part we're going to do in hardware, because we've now learned, we've understood resource requirements, flexibility requirements, you know, how things fail and that kind of thing. I kind of like the idea. I don't want to take up too much of people's time, but the sort of thing that connects the two is that it turns out that 19 years ago, I was dating a girl whose dad was building his own hardware and writing his own software for it. And so I did some work for him, and he was like, okay, so I have my own RTOS, and this is how it works. And I learned all of these techniques from these Berkeley papers. But then the really cool thing about that is that he made it pragmatic. He said, okay, I know I'm not going to have this amazing tool where I model the entire system. I press the big button that generates everything. But his approach was to say, I'm going to mock out all my hardware interfaces within a single binary on my desktop system. You know, in his case, it was he needs to speak to a GPS. So he wrote a virtual GPS that may generate, you know, GPS strings on a serial port, as you know, for example, and then write his firmware to run as a desktop system that essentially simulated the target. And then he had the knowledge to say, okay, now I'm going to go and build the hardware. And of course, it was all in, you know, in his head. He was, you know, one guy doing all of this. So he has a lot of advantages of being able to, you know, he doesn't have a communication gap and that kind of thing. But I thought that was quite a cool technique. It's not something that I've seen elsewhere. So, you know, every time I hear people say hardware software co-design, it's like, wow, okay, you know, maybe somebody else is doing this too.
I will definitely say that the theory behind it of treating the problem as something from all the lower layers of the hardware up through the highest levels of software as one problem space, and then trying to understand what challenges you run into, and then figuring out where in the stack is the appropriate place to deal with those challenges applies. It's just that we're not taking the approach of, and most folks who talk about hardware software co-design take an approach of, it's more humans solving the problem rather than making a big modeling system and having it try to solve it. But it's definitely instead of feeling limited by the boundaries that already exist in the system, you know, I don't need to respect the EFI boundary as a boundary. I can change both sides of that. So now I can make changes to better accomplish the goal that I have in mind, rather than trying to develop workarounds for limitations in those interfaces.
I feel like that is to me, the way that I've understood the story of Oxide from the start. It is that vertical control through the stack.
Well, and not having a PC handed to you that needs to be able to run Windows 3.1. If we're freed from that, we have a lot more options on how we can build the system and which abstractions we can discard. And
or the service processor being totally not a BMC, in the sense that we don't support any of that stuff that is traditionally necessary, but it serves the same function, but in a totally different way, because we don't have to care about people connecting their existing, I don't remember exactly what the acronyms are, VNC or whatever it is, to be able to log into your stuff.
Right.
Yeah, and it's about having all these tools in the toolbox, and just as Rick says, and as Cliff is saying too, about replace the difference is we're taking a similar approach. It's just that we've got human judgment and engineering that's actually making those decisions instead of a single unified software system. But to me, having the ability to come up to a problem and say well, what is the right solution to this? Is it an FPGA? Is it a microcontroller? Should this be something that's done in the host CPU? Just that ability. And to me, I think the way we do power sequencing really represents that, where we kind of have an option. Do we do this in the service processor? Do we do this in an FPGA? And in this instance of the product, we're doing it in an FPGA whose bit stream is loaded via the build RS mechanism that Cliff alluded to. In the future, we might change that, and we would change that if it made sense. But this is absolutely makes sense as the way to do it now. And the ability to have all those tools in the toolbox, hardware and software, that to me is what defines our co-design.
The way I think about it is, go ahead, Rick.
Oh, I was just gonna. We did narrowly avoid using Concept HDL, which, as we were trying to figure out why Concept HDL, the Cadence product, is the way it is, we stumbled upon some of the original origins of that back to one of the system design projects, and it was originally based around building supercomputers through hardware-software co-design in the more modeling sense. And we kind of looked at that and said, hey, that's really cool. Let's not do that, because that's really complicated for reasons.
The way that I think about this as a former web programmer is historically you'd see this system boundary and be oh, we can't do better than CGI. I can only write something against the CGI interface. But then, eventually other people came along and invented fast CGI and WSGI and all this stuff. And what we're able to do is both say are those specs better, but also just do we need them at all? Let's build the web server and the web application together, because that interface is overhead, and make the appropriate trade-off for whichever part of the system that we're building at. And sometimes that is conforming to existing interfaces, and sometimes that is eliminating the distinction and coding on both sides of it entirely, and just not needing to care.
And part of the reason that this is important to me, other than that I think it makes better products, is that you could look at this from a interpersonal and organizational dynamics perspective as a value for counteracting Conway's law. Conway's law being the notion that the structure of a product or a software application tends to reflect the structure of the organization that created it. And I think that in general, that's a bad thing. And keeping things fluid and keeping the product from reflecting a siloed organization in a siloed product design with narrow interfaces, if you can pull it off, gives you the ability to not only iterate faster, but produce a better product in the end.
Totally. That's repealing Conway's law is definitely something that you can do when you have all those tools in the toolbox. So I know we were kind of coming up on the 2 hour mark. Yeah, sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, so just one of the other things that I have to say, as someone who's been sort of watching the whole Hubris presentations occur here, is that it's incredibly interesting to me to see what happens when people who are typically used to sitting high in the stack and have all these nice things encounter embedded development and all the rough edges people have been putting up with. And things like just having gone through and put in humility diagnose, which at least in the web demos looks phenomenal. Like it's like, oh, something's wrong. Well, okay, just tell me what it is. Is fairly alien to anything that I've ever seen in an embedded system, at least. Just like this is basically a strip mine of phenomenal ideas, or at least different ideas.
Yeah, I mean, we are, and I don't know, Cliff, if you want to give a little bit of backstory on humility diagnose, but that's definitely Cliff's invention as we were beginning to see some of the raw parts we had in front of us.
Yeah, I had a script on Loon called AutoCliff, so that when I wasn't around, somebody could run into a problem and then execute AutoCliff, and then I could go on vacation. But
doesn't AutoCliff just say it depends or it's complicated?
I mean, more or less. But keep in mind, I was younger, and may have seen a little more in black and white at that point. But the thing that's often like GDB is a great example of this. GDB notionally supports ARM v7M and the Cortex-M processors, but frequently, if it takes a fault, it can't tell you what fault it took, and that's kind of table stakes. That's the first thing I want to know, and it's in the architecture manual. It's not a secret. So we didn't want to wind up like that, and I wanted to reduce round trips between engineers that were using humility and familiar with Hubris, but not deeply familiar with the processor architecture, like our excellent electrical engineering folks, and me. I'd like to be asleep sometimes. So providing things like that in response to user demand. This is also one of the really nice things about doing all of the testing, bring up, and QA ourselves, is that we're getting customer reviews, we're getting feedback, we're hearing what tools we need in the field, and we can roll them out. And yeah, I honestly put a lot of the credit for this at Rust's feet, not because Rust as a language uniquely enables people to write diagnosis scripts or anything like that, but because the list of things that I'm not thinking about is really, really long right now. And a lot of the things that I would have been thinking about and trying to handle through conventions and code reviews in a large C++ code base, I'm just not thinking about. The type system has me. So I can fritter my days away writing diagnosis scripts instead.
Well, and I think humility diagnose tacks into the fact that if a task is failing, it is very likely panicking. It is much less likely to be dying on memory corruption, or it is probably either overflowing its stack or it is explicitly panicking. That can be hard when the system is automatically restarting tasks to figure out why is this thing panicking. And humility diagnose allows it to say, like, okay, well, let's just do the thing that let's do the AutoCliff thing, and let's actually see if this thing is restarting, and if it is, here's the panic message and so on, which is really, really helpful.
And definitely, I learned at Google that there are a lot more people who know a programming language than are very, very, very intimately experienced with microcontrollers and architectural level details. And there was always the difficulty of, how do I hire the next group of people to help build applications or things? And
oh my God, yes.
That definitely, there's this whole aspect of, it's not necessarily about making the current developers' lives easier. There's certainly an aspect of that, but it's more about codifying the steps so that the next group of people who are building on top of this don't have to gain all that deep experience. Some people will still have to have that, but you want to.
Say again?
I think we lost him.
Oh.
But it is great in that, like, it's both very familiar in the sense of like production validation and test code. Like that ends up getting written for every board that ends up being produced in substantial volume. But taking that same philosophy and applying it to the operating system and to embedded code is something I definitely intend to steal.
Please do it. Please. Please, can we give you a list of other things that we can steal so we're not the only ones doing it? So can you please steal memory protection as well? Would you mind? Also, could you please steal the need for secure silicon?
Definitely. This is something we badger vendors about at length. Anyway, but yeah, and also like, the debugging ring buffers, which are, floating around in real kernels, but not so much in RTOSes all the time. Those are getting stolen for even more embedded things, for sure.
Also, the ring buffers that are floating around in most kernels that I have experience with, you either get an unformatted string of bytes, or you're doing string formatting at runtime.
What could possibly go wrong with throwing printfs everywhere in your debug code?
Yeah, so the ability to throw enums with meaningful field names into a ring buffer it blew my mind. This was Brian's work. This was not me.
Well, and the ability to do, for example, like one of the challenges that we were having with Hubris is if you, for example, just have an hprintln equivalent where you are formatting a floating point number, you have added an indeterminate amount of text and stack consumption, because as it turns out, formatting a floating point number is very fucking hard. And I mean, it's no slight against the code that does that, but boy, is it nice to be able to do all of that the floating point processing in Humility and not have to do it at all in Hubris.
What, Brian? You mean you don't always want to go %06.f3f?
Well, actually, that I am totally cool with. Maybe it's because I've like lowered my standards for myself. I got no problem with that. What I've got problems with is like, oh, by the way, because you did that hprintln, you now overflowed your stack, or that println has overflowed your stack, and now what was a working task is now a dead one.
Well, clearly, just don't write bugs. But
Exactly. All right. Well, so we are at the 2-hour mark, and I feel, Cliff, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really exciting conversation. These are recorded, obviously, so people can go back and listen to it. But I think on behalf of all of us, thank you for Hubris. I mean, we've all been really excited to participate in it. Very excited to have it open and out there. And it's been really exciting for the rest of the world to see what we saw. And I think that, it'd be interesting to know your take on how it's been received. But to me, it's been received really well, and people have seen a lot of the same value that we have seen. So thank you very much.
I'm just delighted that people seem excited about it. That could have gone way worse.
That could have gone way worse, and it's been really exciting to see. It's all open source. All Hubris and Humility is open source. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, one of my favorite videos is Rick, a friend of yours that was had some free time on the day we announced. It's like I think I got an eval board lying around here, and I'll install this, I think, on an F3 or F4. But it was really fun. That's also a great video to check out. We'll put a recording in the show notes. But because it's someone who is kind of like peeling the onion back as they are installing Hubris and appreciating Humility and so on. And then Rick, you obviously did a great job talking about why we had made the decisions we had made. So that's also really good recommended viewing. And then also, man, the docs are great. Huge tribute to a lot of folks, Cliff, you especially, but Steve, you as well, and others. Check out the documentation as well. And with that, I think this, I guess, Adam, we'll leave the option open to do it next week, but we may cancel next week because we're coming up on the holidays. And if we don't see you until the new year, Adam, this is what, our 25th or 26th? 26th. And it's been a lot of fun. We are loving getting to know folks this way. Really enjoying it. So thank you again. Thank you for a great 2021. And Cliff, thanks again for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks,
Happy
Cliff.
holidays.
Great. Take care, everybody.
See y'all later.
Bye.